Okay, there's a huge amount of talk about innovation today. Government panels are studying it, academics are writing papers about it, endless articles are written. We've got wonderful conferences like this one, which are focused on innovation. But by and large, most of these conferences, most of the time when people around the world are talking about innovation, they're talking about it in relation to what's happening in Silicon Valley. And this is a mistake. I mean, by all means, look at what's happening in San Francisco and learn from it, but every economy and every country has a unique economic history and unique strengths and weaknesses in terms of generating innovation. Now, I think Japan's model for innovation has been broken for about the last 35 years, but there's changes happening, and I'd like to introduce you what I see as the three main drivers of innovation in Japan for the next 10 years. So some of them may be familiar, some may be surprising, but I hope by the end of the presentation you'll have a new way of looking at innovation in Japan. How does that sound? Okay, before we get on with the presentation, I think that's a fair question, and I should explain my own background, who I am, and why you should listen to me, at least for the next 30 minutes or so. So I've been in Japan for about 25 years. In that time, I've started 4 companies here. I've sold 2, I've bankrupted 2, so 50-50, that's not too bad as far as startups go. I'm now very active in the startup community as an advisor, consultant, an occasional mentor and investor. I work with TEPCO as the CTO of their Business Innovation Task Force. I teach innovation, or corporate innovation and entrepreneurship at NYU's Shinagawa campus. But I'm mostly known for what started out as a small side project of mine 3 years ago, which is the Disrupting Japan podcast, where I sit down and I talk with Japanese startup founders, not so much about their specific business, but what it's like to grow a business in Japan, what it's like for small startups to try to sell to large companies, what it's like raising funds, what it's like introducing genuinely new technology into a traditionally conservative market. And sometimes simple things like how they manage to convince their wife to let them quit Mitsubishi and start this crazy startup. And when you speak to the people, when you speak to startup founders who are actually out there making the sales and growing their business every day, you get a very, very different perspective and picture of the Japanese economy and the future of Japan than you do when you speak to academics and the trade industries who study the same topics. There's a really good reason for that, but that would take us off our main topic for today. So if you're interested in Japanese innovation, please listen to the show, because I think you'll enjoy it. So, the 3 sources of innovation I see in Japan over the next 10 years. First, startups. Of course, startups. Everyone knows about startups. And they are going to be essential. But rather than spend too much time on them, I just wanted to point out a couple of really important trends that are happening right now. So, in 2015, the total amount of startup investment, venture investment in Japan, hit a new record. And the trend is only looking to accelerate from here on out. Now, to be honest, I've never heard a completely satisfying explanation as to why we're seeing fewer deals and greater investment, but both of these trends look like they're going to continue into the future. So, according to the Venture Enterprise Center, so they reported that in the first half of 2017, the amount of money invested in ventures in Japan has increased 24.3% from that same period last year, and the numbers of deals, surprisingly, have decreased about 1% from the same time last year. So this trend towards larger investments, or larger amounts of total investment but smaller deals, looks like it's going to continue this year as well. Now, this is great news, but there is a qualitative change that's not shown in these numbers. And there's an attitude shift that I think is even more important than these numbers alone. And that is, over the last 15 years, we've seen the development of a true startup ecosystem in Japan. And what I mean by this is when I started my first companies back in 1998, most startups at the time, if they were in like the B2B space, what they were trying to do is to find a single corporate sponsor, a single anchor client who they could sell to, and then they could base their business around, and then maybe branch out and service other clients. Startups didn't really sell to each other at that time. There weren't enough of them. That's changed. A huge amount of startup business is now being done within the startup community. And in fact, there are a number of startups that I've talked to where the vast majority of their business is coming from other startups. And this is incredibly important, not only for like the health of the startups and the ecosystem in general, but to drive innovation in Japan. You see, startups are going to be much more likely to adopt new technologies and new techniques than are large companies. So truly innovative, truly creative startups now have a market. They can sell their new technologies and new ideas to other startups where it can be proven and then adopted by larger companies. And this is something that's just starting to happen, but I think it's perhaps the most exciting aspect of startups today in Japan. So how much of this technology right now is filtering up? How much of this innovation is filtering up into large companies? Well, sadly, I don't think very much yet. And there are two methods in Japan. There are two methods by which startup innovation can get adopted by large companies. The first has been through open innovation and outreach programs. And now in Japan, there's been a few hundred of these programs run over the last couple of years. And I think it's a fantastic sign. Large companies are reaching out to startups and trying to engage with them. And this is new. Again, around 2000, if I sold to a large company, I'd usually be pushed down through two levels of subcontractors. Large companies kind of viewed it as beneath them to work with startups, but this has changed. And I think that the Abe administration deserves a lot of credit, not so much for the programs they've run or the grants, although that's great, but what the government has been doing over the last 5 or 7 years in particular has had high-ranking media officials and even Abe himself getting up and saying, startups are the future of Japan, they're incredibly important to the economy, we need to know what's happening, we need to be paying attention. And this has had a tremendous legitimizing effect on startups, where large companies now feel like, well, we're behind. We need to figure out what's going on in this space. We need to learn more. Now, these open innovation programs, there's a lot of them, and I've been involved with Crew over the years, and they've run almost 100 of these programs, corporate accelerators in Japan. They boast a 100% success rate in that every program has always resulted in a partnership deal, in the large customer becoming a client, some kind of joint research project. But the truth is, most of these projects are nibbling at the edges. The large companies aren't really interested in adopting this type of innovation to their business models just yet. So I think there's been an attitudinal shift, but we haven't really seen results from that yet. The second method is through mergers and acquisitions. Now, strategic M&A is a relatively new concept in corporate Japan. Traditionally, M&A has been distressed assets, often brokered by local or national governments. So the idea of a company looking into the market and saying, we need to be in this market, let's buy one of the top 3 companies in there, and that's our strategy, is new. And again, I think there's been a real shift in attitudes, but right now there is not enough acquisition market to say that it's making an impact in terms of innovation. In fact, Japanese enterprises are far more comfortable acquiring American or European firms than they are acquiring Japanese firms in terms of strategic M&A. So on both of these cases, I think that the trends are in the right direction, that there's been a significant shift in attitude, but we're not seeing a lot of real change on the ground just yet. Now, I love this slide. This slide terrifies some people. So, and to be honest, it's actually much worse than this, because the U.S. defines venture investment far more strictly than Japan does. So even if we adjust for the size of the economy, the U.S. has about 15 times more venture investment than Japan does. Should this worry us? I don't think so. Now, should there be more venture investment in Japan? Well, I mean, if you talk to the VCs, anytime you talk to the VCs, they'll always tell you there's far too much money in the market and all the deals are overpriced. But really, if there was twice the amount of venture money in Japan, there'd be no way to deploy it. There's not enough good startups worth investing in for double the amount of venture investment right now. And I think that's okay, because the Silicon Valley model, what's worked in the US, has worked incredibly well. But the goal is not to meet all the metrics. The goal is to innovate. And while startups are going to be an important part of Japan's innovation in the next 10 years, they're not going to be the main driver. So let me talk a bit about what I see the main drivers going to be. But first, a bit of history. And I promise it's just a bit. But without this background, drivers number 2 and drivers number 3 of innovation will make no sense whatsoever. So for fans of Japanese history, you're going to know most of this. If you don't know much about Japanese economic history, strap in, because we're going to cover a whole lot of ground very quickly. So after the Meiji Restoration, Japanese economy was dominated by the zaibatsu, which were large families / corporate groups that were really economies and, to a large extent, laws unto themselves. Now, the Japanese government in general was perfectly happy working with these groups. They achieved the same end. Although during the run-up to the war and during the war, the government began to worry they were a little too powerful, and some of the most strategic assets were nationalized. Now, after the war was over, the U.S. occupation forces clearly felt that the zaibatsu companies were far too powerful and far too dangerous in influence, and they targeted 16 of these corporate groups for complete dissolution and another 24 for major restructuring. Now, that didn't happen. Well, I mean, don't get me wrong, the power of these corporate groups was reduced significantly, and they were brought into a strong legal framework. But they weren't really dissolved for 2 reasons. First, once the Cold War heated up between the US and the Soviets, all of these progressive democratic reforms that the occupation forces had in mind for Japan suddenly took a back seat to having a stable government and a growing economy. And the occupation forces, quite rightly, understood that keeping a lot of these groups, corporate groups, intact would be much more stable than trying to rebuild from scratch. The second, and perhaps most important reason, was the Japanese hated the idea of breaking up these groups. And not only the government and the leadership of the groups, but the management, the employees of these zaibatsu groups, and most Japanese citizens just did not like the idea. So the corporate groups were allowed to reform into what is known as the keiretsu. Now, there are 6 major and a couple dozen smaller keiretsu groups in Japan. But the keiretsu groups really powered Japanese post-war expansion. In fact, all of the major Japanese brands you know, with the exception, very few exceptions of a few entrepreneurial companies like, most notably Sony and Honda, but almost all the Japanese brands you know are keiretsu companies. And the keiretsu like to keep the business in the family. The business would be financed, projects would be financed through keiretsu banks, keiretsu trading companies. They would be the ones to bring in the foreign expertise and material as needed, and the project would be executed by corporate group companies. Now, standing behind and supporting these flagship companies were hundreds of thousands of small to medium businesses and manufacturers. And I think that Japan's medium-sized enterprises are going to be the most important source of innovation for Japan moving forward for the next 10 years. Why do I say so? Japan's medium enterprises are kind of the middle child of Japan's corporate family. They're the one that gets no attention at all. The keiretsu companies, the big brands, they've got the prestige, they've got the government connections, they have the influence. They largely set Japanese industrial policy. The startups are the youngest child. We give them attention not so much for anything they've accomplished, but for the crazy ideas they have and the crazy things that they say, and just being innovative. And the press and all of us lavish attention on the startups. Just, wow, you've shipped a product. That's amazing. We're so proud of you. Have $5 million. But Japan's medium enterprises are the middle child. They get none of the attention, but they're quietly holding up the entire economy. They're quietly doing their jobs and keeping everything running. And in fact, Japan's medium enterprises are the Japanese economy. They provide 54% of the total employment in Japan. That's more than large and small enterprises combined. And they provide almost half of the total corporate revenues in Japan. Now, a mid-sized enterprise in Japan is actually much smaller than how it's defined in the U.S. So METI defines them as between 20 and 300 employees for manufacturing. So if you're less than 20, you're a small enterprise. If you're greater than 300, you're a large enterprise. And since we're looking for innovation, if we're looking for things of companies that can truly take an idea and take it global, we need to knock out the 75% of the 660,000 medium enterprises in Japan. And if we put aside those that are either strictly local or strictly services, we're left with 25% of the manufacturers with technology that can go global. And this is 165,000 medium enterprises in Japan. And there is amazing technology locked up inside these companies. And I've given some thought about the best way to demonstrate, to prove to you that there's amazing technology hidden inside Japan's medium enterprises, and there are plenty of academic and government reports on technology, but let's face it, that's not the best source. That's not the most credible source for information about innovation. So I thought I would bring in an expert that we all agree is a world authority on innovation, and that's Apple. Now, Apple has over 700 companies that are involved in the production of an iPhone. And they're in the enviable position of being able to go out all over the world to find the best suppliers. And they're not passive about it. They don't just wait for bids. They actually go out and hunt down the right companies to make up this supply chain. Now, of these 700 companies, what country do you think that most of them are in? They're in China. Of course they're in China. 349 of these companies are in China. And that makes sense because China is a low-cost producer and they can achieve massive scale extremely quickly. But what's surprising is that the second most, the number 2 in that list is Japan. That there are 139 suppliers in Japan. And after that, it drops off pretty quickly. There's 60 from the United States, and then there's like 30 each from Taiwan and Korea, and then it's into single digits for the next 26 countries that make up the supply chain. So who are these companies in Japan? Now, many of them are names you'd recognize and expect, like Japan Display and Panasonic and Sony, Murata Manufacturing. But the majority of them are mid-sized companies. They're companies that have gotten incredibly good at doing one thing, that do have this amazing technology. And Japan, these are not low-cost suppliers. They're high-cost suppliers. Japan has some of the most expensive labor and environmental regulations in the world. And despite that, there's a huge number of manufacturing companies who have consistently managed to stay 5 or 6 years ahead of whatever can come out of Taiwan and Korea. And these companies, I believe, are going to be the most significant source for innovation in Japan in the next 10 years. Okay, so even if we know there's technology locked up inside these companies, even if we agree that there is innovation here, what's going to be the trigger to make these companies change from mere supply chain producers into innovators, into companies that create products? Well, quite frankly, it's going to be the fear of going out of business. And for this to make sense, I want to go back and pick up our story of the Keidetsu where we left it off. So actually being a mid-sized company in a Keidetsu supply chain early on wasn't a bad deal at all. The Keidetsu company, the Keidetsu groups would provide financing, technology transfer, and most importantly, guarantee a certain level of sales every year. So all these companies had to do was manufacture technology extremely well. They just had to do their job and focus on it. And that system worked really well as long as everyone was making money and profits were growing. And in fact, it's generally considered we hit peak Keidetsu in 1988 when 55% of Japan's stock market was held in these Keidetsu cross-shareholdings. And after that, cracks rapidly began to appear in the Keidetsu system. And as the economy went down and profits went down, big companies in Japan did what big companies everywhere do when profits are down and margins are tight. They squeeze their suppliers. So all of these mid-sized companies had to get leaner. They had to operate with less. They had to get more innovative. And they did. But over the next 20 years, it would decrease. What would happen is even that promise of the guaranteed sales would go away as the Keidetsu began to diversify their own supply chain, mostly into China and Southeast Asia. So what we have today is a huge number of innovative companies who for the very first time are having to learn how to market and sell. And the fact is, most of these companies are going to go out of business. And that's a terrible thing for those companies, but a few of them are going to be able to innovate and productize. And the reason I say this is if you're looking at a 150-person company, a charismatic leader can turn that company around. He can refocus it. He can say, we have this technology, how do we build products around it? And all of these startup tools and techniques that are being used by Stanford University students and Todai University students, all of these techniques that people are using for rapid prototyping and inexpensive reach to global markets, all of these startup tools are available for medium-sized enterprises who want to adopt it. So how many will? It's hard to say. But if only 1% of this 165,000 mid-sized manufacturers successfully begins to productize their technology, successfully begins to use startup tools to access global markets, that will be enough to completely change the direction of the Japanese economy. Just 1%. And let's say 10% try it, or even 5% try it. If 5% of this 165,000 companies begin experimenting with startup tools and productizations and new innovations, that will utterly dwarf the economic impact of all of the startups in Japan combined. So while startups are an important part of innovation, I think much more exciting is to look at what's going to happen in these mid-sized companies. Now, we're almost out of time, so I'll be quick. And I think the third source of innovation that's going to be coming out of Japan is what I call the new breed of software companies. And there's a very important distinction between software companies in Japan today and the way they existed 20, 30 years ago. And This is the reason that most Japanese software is absolutely terrible. So Japan actually was very strong in software back when it was tied into hardware, back in the mainframe area. They were globally competitive. They were as good as anything coming out of the US or Europe. Now what happened in the PC era, again, this goes back to our Keidetsu history, the Japanese economy had grown large enough that the Keidetsu groups formed this captive audience. So there was a tremendous number of software companies in Japan within the Keidetsu groups who their only business was selling to other members of the Keidetsu groups, the systems integrators. They weren't trying to be globally competitive. They were trying to just glue the pieces together and make it work well enough so that the sponsors of the project could claim victory. And this lack of respect for quality, unusual in Japan, but this lack of respect for quality resulted in a lack of respect for software engineering and for software engineers in general. So back in the 80s and 90s, software engineering was viewed almost as a blue-collar job. So it was perfectly fine if you were a software programmer in your 20s, but if you were 30 and you were still a software developer, your career was clearly off track. Now, the web era introduced companies like Mixi, DNA, and Rakuten, allowed them to bypass all Keidetsu and market controls through this new technology called the web. They were quite successful in new markets, but mostly focused domestically. And the attitude towards software engineering was pretty much the same as it was in the big companies. The real change, both in corporate direction and the attitudes towards software development in Japan, came after 2000 with the advent of cloud computing. The reason being, suddenly became so inexpensive to start a company. For a few million yen, you could legitimately build a product, market it, get distribution. And for the first time, we saw software engineers leaving the big companies and starting their own. So you had powerful software companies who were being led by software engineers, as opposed to led by finance or the sales type. And so the current generation of software development in Japan, they've started 30 years behind where the US was. So there's a lot of catching up to do, but there are engineers following their own vision. And that is important, and that is new. And now, granted, there's a lot of overlap between what I'm calling the new software companies and startups, but it's a distinction that's important enough that we should pay attention to this space. And while we've not yet seen any Facebook or Google come out of Japan, I think that the amount of innovation and the amount of creativity and change within this sector is absolutely astounding, and we need to pay attention to it. So again, startups are extremely important. They get a lot of attention, they deserve it. But I think in Japan, especially in Japan, we're going to be seeing more innovation coming from the new generation of software startups and also from Japan's mid-sized industries. So thank you so much for your attention and for coming out today. Thank you.